Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today on a post-election analysis, as well as a deeper dive and conversation around how students at both the California community colleges and the California State University system can access free legal support services across our various campuses. Just keeping in mind a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and we'll be sharing that out with all of you in the next day or so, along with all of the resources, the PowerPoint presentation that is being discussed today. And now I will turn it over to our colleague, Sally from the ILRC.
Thanks so much, Alonso. If you wouldn't mind putting it on the next slide. I'm Sally Kinoshta from the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, and I'm so pleased to be here with you all today. Thank you so much for having us. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Grizel Ruiz and Allison Davenport, who are both supervising attorneys at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. Next slide, please. If you're not familiar with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, the mission of the ILRC, we're also called the ILRC, is to work with and educate immigrants, community organizations, and the legal sector to build a democratic society that values diversity and the rights of all people. We're a national nonprofit organization headquartered in San Francisco. We train attorneys, paralegals, and community-based advocates, and also inform the media, elected officials, and the public to shape effective and just immigration policy and law. And we work with grassroots immigrant organizations to promote civic engagement. We'll be here with you for the next hour and a half or so to summarize a little bit about what we think is on the horizon under a Biden administration and to answer your questions at the end. If you could go to the next slide, please, Alonso. So January 20th, 2021, President-elect Joe Biden will become the President of the United States, also sometimes referred to as POTUS. Next slide, please. What is the Biden administration planning? Well, we're going to give a brief summary today based on what we've heard. And when we say what we've heard, we're talking about based on what the Biden immigration platform says on his website, statements he's made to the media, and statements he's made on the campaign trail. So I'm going to briefly cover some of what he has said, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to go into a little more detail when I'm done speaking. Day one, Biden has said he is prepared from day one to deliver leadership and solutions to address the Trump-created humanitarian crisis at our border, bring our nation together, reassert our core values, and reform our immigration system. That's a lot of words in which he talks about solutions and leadership, but what are those solutions, and does he have the leadership to make those changes? When he talks about what his plans are, he talks about them in terms of his first 100 days, and then the 4 pillars of the first year. In brief summary, some of the things that he's mentioned that he would do in the first 100 days are very ambitious, and they include things like rescinding Trump's travel ban. That was something that Trump introduced within weeks of his becoming president. It affected mainly people from a dozen or so majority Muslim countries. Biden would seek to rescind that ban. He would reverse family separation policies at the border, end prolonged immigration detention, reverse a new public charge rule that was put into place earlier this year. He would end funding for the border wall that Trump proposed. He wouldn't take down the 400 miles of wall that have been built under Trump, but he wouldn't fund more funding for building more of the wall. He says he would reinstate or reinforce DACA and quote unquote explore all legal options to protect the families of DACA recipients from separation. He would also ensure Dreamers are eligible for federal student aid, including loans and Pell Grants. He includes Dreamers in his proposals to provide access to community college without debt and invest in historically Black colleges and universities, and Hispanic serving institutions and minority serving institutions. He says he would review the TPS, temporary protected status policies, and withdraw from agreements with certain Central American countries that have permitted the United States to shift rejected asylum seekers to those countries. So that's some of what he has planned for the first 100 days. Then he says in the first year, he also has 4 pillars that include legislative immigration reform, strengthening communities, securing the border, and focusing on the causes of migration in Central America. Just briefly, I'll go into a little more detail about his legislative proposals. He said that he would create a roadmap for citizenship, a roadmap to citizenship for the nearly 11 million undocumented people in the United States. This would include also possibly creating a pathway specific for TPS holders. He said he would reform the visa program for temporary workers in certain industries and temporary visa program for highly skilled workers. He would create a path to legalization and citizenship for agricultural workers, and create an exemption to any caps that we have on visas for graduates of PhD programs in certain STEM fields. He actually said that he believes that foreign graduates of US PhD programs should be given a green card with their degree. Other possibilities that have been discussed, notably, Biden was not aligned with some of his more progressive Democratic opponents that actually wanted to abolish ICE. He said that he is not for abolishing ICE and instead called for increasing training and oversight of ICE and Border Patrol. But he did also say that one of his goals would be to end for-profit detention. Next slide, please. So how easily can he do all this? As I mentioned, it's a very ambitious plan. And the truth is how easily these policies can be changed really depends, and it's kind of complicated. So let's go on to the next slide. There are many things that impact how we experience immigration policy and practice in the United States, and they include legislation and laws, regulations and rules, executive orders, executive actions, immigration policy memos, guidance, manuals, litigation, and lawsuits. There are many things that can impact immigration. Next slide, please. So for example, legislation and laws are really required for any new legalization program, meaning any policy that's going to create green cards for people will require legislation and it becoming a law. Regulations and rules are what actually impacts how those are implemented. So for example, earlier this year, there was a new public benefits program, a new public charge rule. Which public benefits trigger public charge is something that actually comes up in regulations and rules. And then there are certain things that can be created through an executive order or action, like DACA or TPS. Policy memos are what can be invoked when there are changes to priorities for who is deported or who can be removed. And then there's lawsuits and litigation that can stop or start certain programs. For example, the stopping and starting of DACA and the new public charge rule were really impacted by what was going on in certain lawsuits. Next slide, please. And who makes the decisions in those? When it comes to legislation and laws, it's really Congress. It's the federal US Senate and House of Representatives that are needed for legislation and laws. Regulations and rules are when we have a law in place, they're implemented by the federal agency in charge. So when it comes to immigration, a lot of immigration is determined by the Department of Homeland Security. If it involves cross-border issues, it can involve the Department of State. And if it involves our immigration courts specifically, it can involve the Department of Justice. Executive orders like DACA or TPS can be announced by the president and or by the president through his cabinet members like the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Secretary of DHS. Policy memos are issued again by the federal agency in charge. For us in immigration, that's usually Department of Homeland Security or its other agencies like USCIS, US Citizenship and Immigration Services. And then litigation and lawsuits are what are determined through the courts by judges. So there are many different levels of decision-making that can impact immigration. It's not the president alone who can determine a lot of this. The last two, executive orders and policy memos, are actually the easiest for any new administration to implement. But again, they could be slowed down or stopped by courts or judges after they are introduced. Next slide, please. So what are some of the factors that could affect the timing and potential of some of these policies actually coming into place? Just some of them that we could share. For example, transition communication. Joe Biden is not president until January. Typically, during a transition like this, there would be communication between the outgoing administration, the Trump administration, and the incoming president. However, there have been a lot of slowdowns in this kind of communication because, as of today, the Trump administration has not yet acknowledged that Joe Biden won the election. So there are officials in the government who've been instructed not to communicate with the new administration and start some of that transition. Um, Inauguration takes place January 20th, as we mentioned. None of these policies can be introduced by Joe Biden or any of the work started or the first 100 days started until that date. Also, there are going to be a lot of priorities for the new administration. As everyone knows, COVID-19 remains a concern. So although immigration is a really important issue to many Americans, including this administration, there are competing priorities with the rollout of the vaccine, of an economy that's really in turmoil right now because of the vaccine. And there are also competing concerns that anything that could open up immigration could create the kind of travel or cross-border migration that public health officials are actually trying to stem right now to limit the spread of the virus. Congressional seats also will make a difference in the ability of any kind of legislation to be passed. Realistically, for anything that's controversial, any new legislation or law will require 60 senators out of the 100 to support any new bill. You all may have been following that currently there are 2 outstanding Senate seats that are still in a runoff. They are taking place in Georgia. Both parties are really hoping to win that vote. If the Democrats win, they think they'll have 50 votes on their side, but really Democrats who are going to support Biden's bills will need 60 in order for any kind of bill to end at debate and go for a vote. So this will require a real solidarity among Democrats as well as recruiting some Republicans to their side on any of these bills. Secretary appointments also will be important. As we mentioned earlier, some of these policies can be implemented, announced, or started by the president through cabinet members like the Secretary of Homeland Security. That is a position that's actually confirmed by the Senate. And so it's another area in which politics could play a role if any of these secretary cabinet positions are facing opposition through Senate confirmation processes. And then finally, of course, litigation could stop or start any program that is announced. Next slide, please. I wanted to share on the right-hand side of the screen here, the Biden administration's values that they've stated around immigration, which are really to take urgent action to undo Trump's damage and reclaim America's values, modernize America's immigration system, welcome immigrants in our communities, reassert America's commitment to asylum seekers and refugees, tackle the root causes of irregular migration, and implement so-called effective border screening. These are the stated values of the Biden administration. There are many advocates who were pleased to see a very ambitious plan from the Biden administration, who are also, of course, cautious because Biden has been a real centrist when it comes to immigration issues. He has a track record around immigration that has included some good things and some bad things from the perspective of immigrants. However, when you compare the values of the Biden administration, whether or not they're successful, to the priorities of the Trump administration, we do see what we hope will be a different kind of climate for immigrants. As a reminder, again, Trump's priorities when he became president were to end DACA, to build a border wall, to limit legal immigration and refugees, to make asylum more difficult, and to target undocumented people, really all undocumented people, for deportation. So whether or not the Biden administration is successful and whether or not they are sufficiently progressive or bold to actually impact in a positive way the lives of many immigrants has yet to be seen. But really, I think there's a hope among immigrant rights advocates that just a shift in values and a shift in language will have some meaningful effect in small ways for a lot of immigrant families. All right, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Grizel Ruiz, who's going to go into a little bit more detail about what Biden might mean for immigration enforcement.
Thank you so much, Sally. And next slide, please. And just to flag, I know a lot of folks will have a question specifically about DACA. Just note that our next presenter, Allison, will be covering several pieces on the shifts to DACA. So what I'm going to talk about specifically is immigration enforcement. Now, when we're talking and specifically about what shifts we might see regarding enforcement under Biden. And now when I say enforcement, I'm really talking about the manner in which the federal government enforces our federal immigration laws, because they don't have endless resources to enforce every aspect of immigration law against every individual. So there is a tremendous amount of discretion in terms of how they use their resources and in which ways. And so specifically, we're really talking about the manner in which the federal government identifies, detains, and deports individuals, and how we might see these practices shift under Biden. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry, I forgot that this is actually a little, we have some graphics here that take a second to appear. So I want to start off with some context and some background. And I think this will be helpful for folks to know, especially as we learn more from the Biden administration about how these shifts might actually play out on the ground. So let's talk about how immigration enforcement works and how it is that people get funneled into the deportation pipeline. So taking a step back, people can end up arrested by ICE in a variety of different ways. So I think folks are familiar with the concept of ICE actually coming to an individual's home and arresting them in their home, or perhaps arresting someone while they're driving somewhere. These folks are familiar with these, I think, especially because they get covered in the news frequently when they do happen, because they can be obviously so scary and so concerning. And that's also why things like Know Your Rights continue to be very important. But there are a lot of other different ways in which people can end up arrested by ICE. So for example, someone might be applying for immigration benefits. Let's say you are a green card holder who wants to apply for naturalization, which is a great thing, right? Green card holders should be applying for naturalizing. But it's possible, for example, that someone might have a prior criminal conviction that makes them deportable and they didn't realize that. And upon applying, that actually gets them flagged for immigration enforcement and could result in an immigration arrest. The advice is always just to make sure that you consult with an immigration attorney or an expert or a DOJ rep, or with one of the legal service providers that you can be connected through. We do want to urge people to apply to naturalize, of course, just ensuring that we're following all the steps and checking with the legal service provider. But all that to say, there are a lot of different ways in which people can end up being arrested by ICE. A few other common ways at the border. That is a much bigger common way that people end up in proceedings. And also, importantly, actually through contact with the local criminal system. So what people don't know is that contact with the local criminal system is actually one of the biggest ways that people end up in removal proceedings, because ICE really relies on local criminal systems as a force multiplier for federal immigration enforcement. Next slide, please. So what you have here is a graph that basically lays out ICE arrests in the interior. And when I say interior, I mean not counting the arrests that happen at the border. So what you see here is that, and this is data that actually, it says 2018, but it was actually, this specific data was actually from October 2017 to June 2018. But it is really reflective of trends that we've seen over the years. And you can see that when it comes to interior ICE arrests, around 75% of those ICE arrests actually resulted from people who had contact with the local criminal system. So for example, through arrests that happen with local police, with sheriffs at the local level, or also in state prison. But essentially that contact for these categories of people resulted in individuals being transferred over to ICE. And this is because local law enforcement, like county sheriffs and state prisons, do frequently voluntarily cooperate with ICE to turn individuals over. One important note is that these agencies, these local and state agencies, are not required to cooperate in this way. And we do have a variety of laws at the local and at the state level that limit this to some degree. And there's continued advocacy in this arena in California and in other parts of the US as well. But this is why it's also just important to have this background, because understanding that this intersection between our local criminal systems and between federal immigration is really the primary way that individuals end up in proceedings, especially when it comes to interior enforcement. That's also important to watch out because we want to see how Biden is going to shift practices across the board with immigration enforcement, but we're always really, but we're particularly interested in how this is going to happen at this intersection. Next slide, please. So let's talk about immigration detention, because that's obviously a huge piece of the puzzle as well. So we talked a little bit about how people end up arrested by ICE. So what happens afterwards? What is immigration detention? So immigration detention is the often discretionary practice of detaining people for the duration of their civil immigration case. Now, a quick note that just because you're arrested by ICE doesn't mean you're automatically going to be detained. Certain people are detained, others are not. There are a lot of different legal and discretionary reasons that one might happen. But one thing we did see is under the Trump administration, we saw them exercise their discretion more and more frequently to decide to detain individuals. So we saw an increase in detention under Trump because they decided to detain more and more people. In fact, we did see a huge expansion of detention under Trump. Under Trump, we saw the highest detention figures that we'd ever seen under any other president. The highest number, I believe, was over 50,000 people in one day. At the moment, right now, we are much lower than that, but that's due to COVID, for example, and also due to changes in practices at the border. But that was a big hallmark of the Trump administration. But that also is one thing that we do expect to change under Biden. So as Sally stated, Biden has already stated that he's going to end private immigration detention and also invest in alternatives to detention. Now, a quick note that immigration detention plays out in a variety of different ways in the U.S. We have private contracts. We also have public contracts where ICE actually contracts with local county jails to detain people in immigration proceedings. And we also have a few ICE-run facilities. So it is, or immigration advocates are initially excited to see that he has committed to end private detention, because that actually is the largest number or results in the largest number of immigration detention beds across the US. It's around 60-70% nationwide and over 90% in California. However, advocates are very keen on figuring out or interested in seeing how this is going to play out. So for example, folks are very invested in seeing that these beds don't just go from private incarceration to public or ICE-run facilities. Advocates are very interested in ensuring that these facilities close and that those individuals are released, as opposed to just shifting to a different type of facility. And that's why, while we have a little bit of information and there's some initial excitement about the possibility, folks are very interested in seeing how this is actually going to play out. Are we really going to close these facilities for good? On what timeline and in what sequence? So there is still a lot that we still need to know about what that end to private detention might look like, but it's certainly very exciting to see this as a possibility, especially because it does play such a huge role in immigration detention. Next slide, please. Okay, a quick note. So we talked about how people end up arrested by ICE. We talked about for those individuals who are in immigration detention, what shifts we might see. What about when people are in front of an immigration judge in their removal case? So immigration court, and a quick note that some people are placed in immigration removal proceedings. And when this happens, you essentially go in front of a judge. There is also a trial attorney who's like the immigration prosecutor. And you also have the right to have your own attorney in immigration court. A quick note that you do have the right to have an attorney in court, but we don't have the right to government appointed counsel the way you see in criminal proceedings. So what this means is that there's no public defender in immigration cases. So that means that it's up to the individual to find an attorney, for example, through resources that you have here through this program, through nonprofits, private attorneys, etc. But you do have the right to an attorney in removal proceedings. You just have to secure it on your own. And also one important note too is that in immigration, just because you end up in immigration proceedings doesn't mean that you're automatically going to be deported. This is an opportunity to explore your legal options to see what avenues you might have in your specific case to possibly stay in the US, but that is very case specific. And so how did we see removal proceedings shift under Trump? So we saw an even greater backlog in immigration cases. We also saw increased pressure to immigration judges to expedite and move those cases as quickly as possible. Judges actually have a quota that they're supposed to get through for a certain period, which obviously creates a lot of problems for advocates and for people in proceedings, because as it is, there are already a lot of due process concerns. So to expedite cases that people really need more time on has created a lot of problems under the Trump administration. Other problems that we saw were more appointments to immigration judge positions for people who used to be immigration prosecutors. So we now have more immigration judges who come from the immigration prosecutor background, which obviously has sort of shifted practices in terms of how cases are adjudicated. And we also saw a lot of memos come from the Trump administration to judges and to immigration prosecutors to basically just make it much harder to work cases. Again, pressure to make these cases go faster, to fight more issues. It just has become a really, really difficult situation in immigration court under the Trump administration. So what changes might we expect under Biden? So we do expect an alleviation of the backlog that we're seeing in immigration court. We expect to see, for example, more discretion provided to immigration judges so that they're hopefully allowed to adjudicate cases in a manner that leads to more equitable proceedings in removal proceedings. And so we hope that there will be some shifts in discretion that result in people having a more fair chance to adequately present their case. Next slide, please. So here's just a quick summary of some of the changes that we might see enforcement-wise under Biden, and as compared to some of the shifts that we saw under Trump. So I'll just run through these quickly, but huge caveat that there's still a lot that we don't know, and there are a lot of details that we are still missing. So I think this area in particular, it's going to be really important for folks to just stay updated, watch the news, follow organizations who track these issues to get up-to-date information on what these changes are actually going to look like on the ground. So the first item is under Trump, we really saw increased federal criminal prosecutions in family separations at the border. So when we saw all of the news waves about family separations at the border, that really resulted from the federal government essentially prosecuting parents in federal criminal court or guardians who were coming in. And because of those prosecutions, the parents were separated from the children, and that's what resulted in the family separations that we saw. So Biden has stated that he's going to end this zero tolerance prosecutor policy. So that's actually something that's very exciting. Under Trump, another thing that we saw was essentially everyone was a priority when it came to ICE arrests. Previously under Obama, we had seen a slight narrowing, and Obama had essentially said that they were only going to, or were mainly going to focus resources on arresting certain individuals and not others. Under Trump, he basically got rid of that and said everybody is a target, resources permitting. And Biden has stated that he's going to shift immigration enforcement priorities, but I think this is a place where we really, really want to watch out and see how that's going to happen, in particular because there is a tremendous concern from immigration advocates with relying on criminalizing language or criminalizing framing that's going to justify going after certain individuals who've had contact with the criminal system, which is a tremendous concern in terms of due process and in terms of how certain individuals might be scapegoated or essentially cast aside. Another thing that we saw with regards to Trump, again, we saw massive expansion of detention. As I already stated, we do expect to see an end to private immigration detention, but there's a lot to be seen in terms of what that's going to look like, what timeline, how that phasing out is going to occur. So advocates right now are thinking through how to hopefully be part of that decision making. And then finally, under Trump, we definitely saw increased border enforcement and obviously the building of that wall. And so Biden has stated that he's going to stop the border wall construction, but that he is going to increase technology and surveillance at the border. So that signals that border enforcement is going to continue with increased reliance perhaps on technology and surveillance. And that too is an area that advocates are very concerned about because when it comes to surveillance and information sharing, that implicates a lot of privacy concerns, and that also implicates sort of increased harsh enforcement at the border. So that's another area to continue watching out for. Next slide, please. And so here I'll just note that there is still a lot of information that we still need to see and that we still need to learn in terms of what these changes are really going to look like. Again, we do expect to see a shift in the manner in which immigration enforcement happens, but in terms of the details, in terms of what that looks like on the ground, in terms of what that happens, how that works out with the intersection between the criminal system and immigration system, there's a lot that we still need to see, and advocates right now are very eager to help shape what that conversation and what those policy pieces look like. For folks who are interested in keeping up to date on this information, follow organizations such as ours on social media. We do focus on providing community resources on issues such as this. Another great organization, Immigrant Defense Project, IDP, they also really focus on that intersection, as well as the ACLU. And I know, next slide, please. The last thing that I'll note just very briefly is that know your rights information continues to be extremely important. For time, I'm actually going to skip the slides that I have set right now on know your rights information. And I know that you've already received a lot of information on this topic, but just note that no matter what administration we have, know your rights always continue to be important because we, our community, our people, we can often be sort of that first frontline defense just by understanding our rights and actually asserting our rights. That can make a huge difference in people not ending up in removal proceedings to begin with. And so with that, I think we'll have to skip several slides ahead, and then I will pass it over to Allison.
Great, thanks so much, Grisel. And yeah, we're going to switch gears a little bit and go from talking about enforcement and the deportation pipeline and the role of ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and switch to a focus on immigration legal options, benefits, protections, and those are usually offered through USCIS, or the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to walk us through DACA and TPS. There's been updates even in the last week on both of those programs, and then also mention asylum and public charge, and then just kind of preview some of the areas or some of the changes we might be seeing under the new administration. So next slide, please. Let's start with a hot topic, which is DACA, but I just kind of want to return to some of the framework that Sally outlined at the very beginning of the webinar today, which is that certain things fall under our federal immigration law, also known as our Immigration and Nationality Act. The law is something that requires Congress and the approval of the president to be changed. Some examples of things that are part of our federal immigration law are who's eligible to become a U.S. citizen, which U.S. citizens or permanent residents can petition which members of their family, when people can apply for something called the U visa, which is for victims of crime. Those things are part of our federal law and can't be changed. So even though, unless there's been an act of Congress, so even though we've seen all of these changes under the Trump administration in the area of immigration policy, we really haven't seen any changes go through Congress. What we have seen are these administrative, executive kind of rules and policy guidance changes. That's kind of on the right hand of your screen. Those kind of executive or regulatory changes are things like the DACA program. So that was formed by an executive action by the Obama administration in 2012. We're going to walk through the changes that have been made since then in just a second. Things like which countries get designated for TPS, the public charge rule. Those are things that are within the purview of the president, the administration, the executive branch. And that's where we've seen a lot of this shifting happening during the last few years. So I'm just saying that to kind of give context to some of our remarks and why we've seen so many changes in certain areas and then so few changes in other areas, and what that means for the next few years and what kind of changes we can expect. All right, next slide. So let's kind of dive into DACA as an example. So we all know DACA was established in 2012. We also know the Trump administration tried to terminate the program in September of 2017. Immediately, several lawsuits were filed to block the termination of DACA. That resulted in a federal court order requiring renewals to continue. That restarted the renewal process in January 2018. And since that time, we've seen people be able to renew, but the opportunity to apply for DACA for the first time has really been foreclosed until more recently. That case, these lawsuits wound their way through our legal system and ended up before the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court heard arguments in the DACA case last year in November and issued their decision in June of this year, of June 2020. That decision said that how the Trump administration terminated the DACA program was not lawful. It didn't comply with federal law that guides administrative policies. And therefore, that memo that was issued in 2017 was invalid. And as a result, the DACA program should be restored because the termination memo was invalid. So a lot of us, this was a huge victory for DACA recipients, for the immigrant rights community who fought for years to push back against these changes. But in the aftermath of that decision, that positive decision for DACA, we didn't hear anything from Homeland Security, from USCIS about how they were going to implement that decision and how DACA was going to be restored. Instead, a little over a month went by, and then the Department of Homeland Security issued a new memo, and we're calling it the July 2020 memo. And they basically said, okay, well, the Supreme Court made this decision. We're going to review the DACA program in more carefully, according to what the Supreme Court ordered. And in the meantime, we're going to make a few changes to the program. Since we aren't sure what ultimately we're going to do with it, we're going to only allow renewals. We will not accept first-time applications. When people renew, they'll only get DACA for a 1-year period, not 2 years as it had always been. And we're going to limit who can travel with those travel permits called advanced parole for folks who want to go outside of the country. And they want to limit it to only people who have exceptional circumstances in terms of their need to travel abroad. So this was the new memo that was instituted in July. Again, there were several lawsuits challenging this memo that was limiting the DACA program. And just last week, a federal court in New York ordered that memo was invalid because the department head, the secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, had not been properly appointed to his position. And therefore, policies and memos that were issued in his name were invalid. So that order just came down last week. We saw the administration update finally the USCIS website saying there was this court order out of New York. We are restoring the DACA program because the July 2020 memo has been held invalid. So where does that leave us right now? What should DACA recipients or DACA eligible folks do right now? Next slide, please. We definitely want folks to continue to renew. So DACA recipients, if you have DACA now and your DACA case is going to expire, or your DACA case has already expired, we encourage you to go ahead and renew. DACA will now be renewed for the regular 2-year period. People who are eligible to apply for DACA and never had the opportunity to do so, or are just aging into the program, just turning 15 and are eligible to apply, we really encourage people to start gathering documents and to consult with a legal expert about your eligibility, and also to see what other legal options you might have available to you. People who had applied for renewal in the interim period and were issued a 1-year DACA renewal, they are going to have their DACA approval and work permit extended to 2 years. So that 1 year will automatically be extended to 2 years, and there's going to be some way in which the Immigration Service notifies those folks that they're going to be automatically extended to 2 years. We don't have all the details of what that's going to look like, but that is forthcoming. So people won't need to renew at the 1 year mark. They'll be automatically extended for the full 2 years. And then, of course, without that July memo, the advanced parole process, those travel permits, will be restored to their original form, which allows for travel based on education, employment, and humanitarian reasons. Okay, so next slide. So that's where we are now. But there's still a lot of moving parts to the DACA program. Next slide. We have, for example, these continuing challenges to the DACA termination. Those cases are still going forward. It does look like the Immigration Service is complying with that court order out of New York, which is great news. People are filing for renewals and applying for initials as well as advanced parole already. However, not only were there these challenges to the termination of DACA or to the July 2020 memo to limit DACA, but since going back several years, there has been a legal challenge to DACA itself, to the legality of the program itself. That was filed by the state of Texas and several other states. And that case has been pending for quite some time. It is now set for a hearing before a judge in Texas for December 22nd, so in just a couple of weeks. That judge in other cases has been unfriendly to DACA and other kind of immigrant programs. And so there is some concern about how that judge might rule and how this could affect the implementation of this more recent pro-DACA ruling out of New York. So it is possible that that federal judge will issue a ruling sometime after December 22nd and even before President-elect Biden is sworn in on January 20th. So we aren't quite sure how all of those things are going to sync up. It's likely that even if they rule against the DACA program, there will be an appeal. So even if they rule that DACA is, for example, illegal and should be ended, there will be an appeal of that decision. Whether the appeal will include that the decision won't be implemented, so there'll be a stay or a hold on implementing that decision while the appeal is pending, that's very unclear. It's possible that the Trump administration could do something else around DACA. We just don't know at this point. It seems unlikely given the fact that we have this new ruling from New York and we also have this pending case out of Texas. So let's fast forward to January and think about what we can expect from the Biden administration. Next slide. President-elect Biden has said very clearly that he is planning to protect DACA. So we can assume, although it depends a little bit on what we see come out of the Texas case, we can assume that President-elect Biden will protect the DACA program. Whether he expands the program, meaning making it more generous or accessible to more individuals, that's not clear right now. He has also referenced exploring other legal options for DACA recipients and their families. So kind of reminds me a little bit of the DAPA program that we saw several years ago. So that's some general language, but it is hopeful that he's considering not just the DACA population, but kind of the broader undocumented population, including the family members of DACA recipients. And then, as Sally mentioned, some general language about trying to increase access to financial aid and other support for access to higher education, loan forgiveness, Pell Grants, things like that. So that's kind of a snapshot of where we are with DACA. I think it's something we're going to continue to need to follow very, very closely. Again, there's a lot of moving parts, but at this moment, people are able to renew for a 2-year period, apply for advanced parole, although travel right now with the pandemic could be a little bit complicated given travel restrictions and of course the public health risks. And also people are able to apply for DACA for the first time. So we'll hear from your legal services providers at the end of the webinar where you can go for more information and support. Okay, next slide. Another topic that's in the news lately is temporary protected status. That's a form of status that's given to nationals of certain countries where they have experienced armed conflict, like a civil war, some sort of natural disaster, or some sort of extraordinary circumstance where the US government says it is not safe to return people, nationals of that country, to their home country at this time, given that situation. And the Department of Homeland Security has the authority to designate those countries. They're usually designated for an 18-month period, more or less. And then at the end of that 18-month period, they can reauthorize that country for TPS designation. So one example would be El Salvador, which in 2001 had a series of very serious earthquakes. It was designated for TPS status in March of 2001. And ever since then, people have been able to renew, people who were in the country at that time when it was designated a TPS country have been able to renew their TPS status since then. And currently there's about 250,000 Salvadorans that have TPS. So that's just an example of what TPS is. But what are we hearing about right now? Next slide. There's currently 10 countries that are designated for TPS at this moment. The Trump administration has said they are going to terminate the TPS designation for 6 of those countries. So on the left side of your screen are the 6 countries that have been terminated, but their status has been extended through October 4th, 2021. So they are on kind of the list of TPS countries to be terminated, but folks with TPS in those countries have been automatically extended, meaning their protections and their work permits are automatically extended through October 4th, 2021. Those countries include Nicaragua, Haiti, El Salvador, Sudan, Nepal, and Honduras. The 4 other countries that have TPS currently, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and South Sudan, they have been reauthorized and are proceeding normally, and they haven't been, there's been no discussion around termination at this point for those countries. So people who are in one of the 6 countries on the left side of your screen that have been designated for termination, what can they expect under a Biden administration and what can they do now? Next slide. The president-elect has indicated that he will review the TPS designations. So all of those current countries, all 10 of them, he will review them, whether those designations should continue or not, since that is something under the purview of the Department of Homeland Security authority. It is possible that they will simply say, we are not going to terminate TPS for those 6 countries. We are going to reauthorize them. Whether they expand TPS protections, meaning changing the dates or some of the requirements around who can qualify for TPS, that remains unclear. But we're hopeful that when they review them, that they will continue the protections for those 6 countries, especially since so many of the recipients from those countries have had TPS for a decade or more. The other thing that might happen around TPS is there will be an analysis of whether any other countries are in need of TPS protections. Some countries in Central America, like Guatemala, others have been lobbying for those types of protections for their nationals. The most likely country to be designated is Venezuela, and we've heard the Biden administration refer to that in general terms. We don't know, but that is part of the kind of review process for TPS. And then there is, of course, language about supporting a path to legalization for TPS recipients. So again, folks that have been in the country for so long, they've been renewing, every 18 months, past background checks and what have you. Is there any way that those folks can be eligible for a broader legalization program? Okay, so that is kind of where we're at right now with TPS. In the last few minutes, I'm just going to touch on asylum and public charge, and then we're going to open it up for your questions. So next slide. When we talk about asylum, it's really been a relentless series of attacks by the Trump administration on the asylum system. And I would say they fall into kind of two broad categories of attacks. One is kind of restricting the types of claims where someone could be granted asylum. And then the second category would be the processes that an asylum seeker has to go through to seek asylum and to be granted asylum. In terms of the types of claims, one of the biggest shifts we've seen that's been the most harmful to asylum seekers is restricting the types of cases that can be granted asylum. So things like domestic violence victims, people who are victims of gang violence, cases where the person is being persecuted in their home country by someone who isn't necessarily part of the government, but the government is unable or just won't protect that individual from that type of harm. So we had seen some really great progress in these areas. For example, in the area of domestic violence victims from countries where if you report domestic violence or seek protection from the authorities simply say, we won't get involved in family matters and private matters of the home. Those types of cases, we saw progress. That's been pretty much rolled back over the last 4 years. Cases still require an individual analysis, but there's been some bad cases ordered by the Attorney General to restrict those types of cases. So, and these are some of the more common kinds of cases we're seeing, especially out of Central America, where we've seen the greatest need for asylum recently, especially at our southern border. So domestic violence, family violence, LGBTQ violence, gang-related violence. These are some of the cases we hope will be restored in terms of the types of cases that can be granted. Not as a general category, but as a once there's an individual analysis of the case. Next slide. The other area of restrictions we've seen is at the border. So we all know about the incredible amount of asylum seekers that have sought protection at the southern border of our country. We do, as Sally mentioned, expect many of those border policies to be rolled back. For example, the Remain in Mexico program, which essentially gave people who were seeking asylum a number, and they were told to wait in Mexico until they had a hearing before an immigration judge. We expect that program to be wound down. We expect family separation to be completely halted. And these agreements, as Sally mentioned, between some of the Central American countries where people can be sent back to a third country to seek protections there rather than to be processed for asylum here in the United States. We do expect those to be rolled back. How long these processes take and how they're sequenced, I think, is going to be very difficult to predict. But we do hope to see some shifts and kind of a resurgence of humanitarian protections at the border. In terms of public charge, next slide. Public charge is a rule in immigration law. When someone is getting, for example, a green card through a family member, they have to show that they won't depend on public benefits in the future. And the immigration officer kind of does an analysis of different factors in making that determination. And if they're found to be a public charge, their case can be denied. If they are not found to be a public charge, their case can be approved. Under the Trump administration, the rule, the factors, the analysis an officer has to do in those cases changed and became much, much stricter. That new rule went into effect in February of this year. but there has been, again, a lot of litigation and challenges to that rule. So what we have right now is kind of a patchwork about where that rule even applies. Right now, it applies at some USCIS offices in some states and not at other USCIS offices in other states. So it's not in effect at this moment in California, but it is in effect in other states in the country. If someone is processing their case through a US embassy or consulate, it's not in effect at the moment in the US embassies or consulates. Next slide. So we're seeing this kind of patchwork in terms of the implementation of this newer and stricter rule, but the future Biden administration has indicated in its policy platforms that they would like to rescind that public charge rule, and institute a new rule. And how long that takes, how quickly that can be achieved. Some of that has to do with the ongoing litigation we're seeing, and then also some other factors around, rulemaking can be quite a long process. So this rule took several months to be implemented, and so to roll it back might also take several months, but they might issue some guidance in the short term to make it a little bit less strict as it's being applied on a case-by-case basis at USCIS offices. So we're hopeful that there will be positive change on the public charge rule as well. Okay, so that was a really quick recap of 4 important areas. Next slide, but I just want to say also some other things we're hoping we see under a new administration is a rollback of the new, what they call fee rule. So that was there was an announcement to increase immigration application fees and to eliminate fee waivers for low-income applicants for many kinds of immigration applications. We're hoping that can get rolled back. There was a lawsuit challenging that new rule, and that rule has been halted by court order through February 15th of the new year. So that gives the new administration time to come in and perhaps undo that before it gets fully implemented. There might be some more resources and support for naturalization efforts, so green card holders becoming citizens. Also, we're going to see an increase in the number of refugees who are admitted to the United States. Right now, the cap is at around 15,000. President-elect Biden has indicated he would increase the number of refugees coming from abroad into the United States to about 125,000 per year. Okay, next slide. And then legislation, again, as Sally mentioned, a lot of this depends on what's happening in the Congress, the composition of the Congress, the political will in the Congress, and just where immigration falls in different priorities for congressional representatives. We know with the pandemic, there's a lot going on. And so we're just not sure where these kind of fall in line with those other priorities. The DREAM Act for DACA recipients or undocumented youth is one possibility. The Promise Act is the path to legalization for TPS recipients. There may be something around essential workers or farm workers, a more narrow subset of essential workers. An increase in the number of employment visas, both temporary and permanent, trying to streamline existing systems like the U visa system, like the family-based immigration system, so there's less wait times for people who are eligible and have filed their applications. And then, of course, there's always the possibility we'd see some sort of broader legalization program for undocumented immigrants. All right, that was a lot. So I'm going to leave it there and I'll hand it back over to Sally and then we'll take your questions.
Alonso, should we turn over to you to pose the questions, or how would you like us to proceed?
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions already on the queue. And if you are curious about anything or want clarification on any question or any topics that we discussed today, please use the Q&A feature to ask any relevant questions to today's conversation. One of them is about public charge and being implemented in California. If you can just kind of briefly talk about that.
Oh, I can take that one. Sorry, I was trying to figure out if I was on mute. Yeah, so a new public charge was introduced by the Trump administration, and this is an issue that has to do with which public benefits would trigger something called public charge that could bar someone from getting a green card. This is an immigration issue that is changing very frequently. So what I'll share with you now is what is true as of today. And as I said, it's changing very frequently. So the new rule on public charge affecting those who are applying for a green card in the United States is currently blocked. That means including for people who are in California applying for a green card here. The new public charge rule is currently blocked, really only as of last week. So this actually applies to 18 states and Washington, D.C. It's not actually everywhere in the country, which is what makes it kind of confusing in terms of whether or not it applies to everyone. So the injunction blocks it from enforcing the rule here in California, 17 other states, Washington, D.C., but not every state in the country. For people who are applying for a green card from outside the United States, that rule is also blocked as of July.
Thank you, Sally. And then Allison, you briefly mentioned advanced parole. Can you talk about, or what that means, and then the types of circumstances that it allows individuals to travel outside of the U.S.?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. I know I touched on that very quickly. So advanced parole is a type of travel permit that DACA recipients and others, but DACA recipients for our purposes can apply for in order to travel outside of the United States. So for travel inside the US, including Alaska, Hawaii, our US territories, you don't need a travel permit. That's not considered international travel. But to go to other countries, you do require some sort of a travel permit called advanced parole. For DACA recipients, you can only access that type of travel permit if you can show that you need to travel for education, employment, or humanitarian reasons. And the kinds of cases we've seen approved on those bases are things like a study abroad program or doing research abroad. If someone is going on a work assignment to attend a conference in another country, that would be permissible under advanced parole. And then humanitarian reasons are often to do with visiting a family member who might be ill, the death of a family member, to get medical attention, things like that. So DACA recipients do have to have this type of travel permit in order to leave and then re-enter the country. That was a possibility in the original version of the DACA program. It was eliminated when the Trump administration announced the termination in 2017, but has now been restored. So that is now again a possibility for DACA recipients.
Thank you for that clarification. On the same lines of DACA, can you share a little bit more about the current application process? You shared that there's a backlog. How can they know how long USCIS will take to review and accept applications, given that there might be a different ruling in the next couple of weeks?
Right. So again, for renewal applications, we really suggest people apply to renew about 6 months in advance of the expiration of their case. That ensures that they are likely to get renewal approval before the expiration of their current case. So there's no gap kind of in their work permit or protection under DACA. But even if your case has already expired, whether it expired a few days ago or a few years ago, you are eligible to renew your DACA case regardless. For people who are applying for the first time, which is possible as of just a few days ago, you do have to show that you came to the United States before the age of 16, that you've been residing in the United States since June 2007, that you were physically present in the country in June 2012, and you have to have some sort of photo ID. For younger folks, that can be a school ID, it could be a matricula, consular ID, driver's license, AB60 driver's license, what have you. And then you have to show that you complete the education requirement. So that could be that you have a high school diploma or GED, that you're currently studying at a community college, a university, an adult school. It's quite broad, the educational requirement. And then you go through a background check as part of the application process. So we aren't sure, since those cases have just restarted and we do expect kind of a large influx of people applying. We're not quite sure how long those initial cases are going to take to be processed. And because they require so much documentation, they are a bit more cumbersome to process compared to a renewal. So that's still a question. It's something we'll track and we can keep you up to date on.
Great. Thank you for that. And then just kind of how many forms of ID does someone that is applying for DACA need? You mentioned several, but is there like one, two, just a little bit of clarification on that?
So usually just one form of identification. So if you have, your birth certificate and a school ID, that would be sufficient to apply for DACA. If you have a passport, a consular ID, a matricula, a cedula, those types of things would also be acceptable forms of identification.
Thank you. And I think we've answered most of the DACA related questions today. I think one of the pressing ones is if someone can legalize or have a change of status if they have DACA.
Yeah, so people have all of the options that are available to DACA recipients. So if I apply for DACA or if I apply for TPS, it doesn't mean that I don't have the ability to apply for other forms of status. And in fact, we really encourage people to get an in-depth legal consultation to find out if they have options to apply for other forms of status that are better, more permanent than something like DACA. So for example, a DACA recipient could apply for their green card based on the family relationship to a U.S. citizen. So if they have a U.S. citizen spouse, for example, that might give them a pathway to lawful permanent residence. So DACA recipients are not limited in any way in terms of exploring other legal options, but it does require an individual consultation and in-depth analysis of their case and their situation to see if they fulfill the requirements of any other immigration programs.
Yeah, and on that same vein, for children that have immigrant parents, for example, they can petition them around the age of 21. What advice or suggestions can you provide?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our immigration system allows green card holders and citizens to petition different members of their families. U.S. citizens are able to petition their parents once they turn 21 years of age. But the process of becoming a green card holder through a family member is really a two-step process. The first step is that family petition. The second step is the person being petitioned filing an application for permanent residency. So definitely if, for example, I have a U.S. citizen son who just turned 21, he can petition for me. Absolutely, it's his right as a U.S. citizen to petition for me. But it really requires an in-depth analysis of my case to figure out if I am, based on that petition, going to be eligible for the green card. So it's not automatically just because he petitioned me that I'm going to qualify for the green card. A lot of it has to do with what's in my immigration history. How did I enter the country? Have I ever been deported or in immigration court proceedings? Do I have a criminal record? There's all sorts of other factors that might impact my ability to actually get the green card based on that petition. But my U.S. citizen child for sure can petition me. But we do recommend families go together for an immigration consultation to figure out what might be possible, because it can be a very complex situation. Some parents who will get petitioned are eligible to do the process in the United States at their local USCIS office. Other folks, usually due to the fact that they entered the country without a visa, may have to go to their home country and have their case processed at the U.S. consulate or embassy there. And that can cause a lot of complexities with a case and require a waiver. So we really encourage people to get good legal advice before kind of initiating that type of case.
Thank you, Allison. And I think that's a perfect segue into our next topic, which is how students from both the California community colleges and the California State University system can access the free legal supports available at their campus. And I'll bring up my colleague, Ana Aguayo-Bryant, to share a little bit about how students from the CSU system can access legal services.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's webinars. The CSU and also the community college, since 2019, we have been very excited that through the DSS, we have been in partnership with DSS in providing free legal services to all our students. But I want to share, first of all, some of the support services that the CSU has to empower students and to help them reach their goals. So at all our 23 CSU campuses, we do have dream centers, or we have staff that are very, very supportive of our students. They help them with their academics. They provide networks for the students and a lot of personalized support. So just know that if any student, if you're wanting to refer any students to our campuses, at all 23 campuses, we do have support, and we definitely want them to feel welcome and know that we have the financial resources through the California Dream Act, and we have our centers with full-time staff who are assigned to help the students navigate our campuses. So just know that these services are provided again at all 23 campuses, and we have the support network to support our students. And if you could change to the next slide, I want to cover now the different legal services that the CSU offers. So again, I mentioned that in fall 2019, we received a great partnership with the DSS, which has been providing free legal services to all 23 CSU campuses, from Humboldt all the way to San Diego State. There are legal partners that have been assigned, and I'm not going to go through each one of them for the time. But I definitely want you to check out our website, look at the different legal providers that are assigned to our CSU campuses. For those who are not at a CSU campus, but you are needing legal services, we also encourage you to look at our website, because we do have listed on our website all the legal providers within a region. So please take advantage of looking at those resources. But if you are at a CSU campus, we have the legal providers. And one thing that just launched as of this fall is that if any student has any immediate family needing legal immigration services, so if you are a student and if you're undocumented or your family is undocumented and this is immediate family, please seek services, because through our partnership with DSS and these legal providers, they are providing services to the immediate families, as long as you're a CSU student. Next slide. I want to direct you to our website, which is, we try to keep very current. We have all the resources. It's a great place to find our who services our students at every campus. So there is a drop down that you could scroll down and find the campus that you plan to enroll or you're currently enrolled, so you can find out who's able to assist you on the campus. Also, if you want the immigration services, it is listed in our website. So I highly recommend that you take time to check out our website and look at all the resources. We do have a page full of scholarships, because that's always the challenge that many of our students face. And we have that dedicated area for any financial help that you might be needing. Also, for any student that wants to help with admissions, we still have a couple more days for fall 2021 for our system. So if you're considering the Cal State, please check out the admission section, because we are still open, and we definitely would love for you to consider the CSU. And, Alonso and IRC have been great partners, and that's why we continue to have these webcasts available on different topics that are important to you. And now I'm going to hand it over to Alonso from the Community College Foundation Office, who is my great partner in crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And I will do a brief overview of what our students that are attending the California community colleges can do in regards to immigration legal services. So for the California community colleges, we have 9 legal service providers that are listed on the screen now, and there are based on the guided pathways region. So there's 7 guided pathways across the state. And so we use that model to break it down to make it a little bit easier to provide these support services on the campus. And we'll go into more detail of what the campuses are a little bit in the next couple slides. But the legal services, as my colleague Anna mentioned, are available to students, faculty, and staff, and they range from anything from education and outreach on the campus, being able to understand any potential immigration benefits that they will do. So as Allison, Sally, and Grisel have all talked about today, is getting that full, comprehensive, and in-depth consultation with an attorney. That's the type of support services that you can find through the CCCs and the CSUs. So our attorneys are all DOJ accredited. They're all immigration attorneys, and they'll be able to walk through any potential immigration remedies that are available given the various circumstances. And please bring in your family, because as Allison mentioned, sometimes finding that immigration relief means supporting the family. So ensuring that you have all of the proper documentation, that you have those conversations, and some of them might be a little bit hard to have, but they're necessary in order to figure out which of those available immigration policies and remedies you can take advantage of. And all of our attorneys and all of the legal service providers that we work with provide these support services free of charge. The only thing that we can't support the student with, is being able to pay for the filing fee. So if a student qualifies for, let's say, a first-time DACA renewal, the student will get the support service of it from the legal service provider, but the legal service provider may not be able to assist with the DACA renewal fee. So USCIS fees are currently not covered through both the CCC and the CSU services. So like I said, the types of services that are provided are the immigration screenings, DACA renewals, first-time petitions, family-based petitions. They can assist with naturalization, U visas, legal permanent residency. We're currently not able to support students that might find themselves, or not just students, but our students, faculty, or staff that might find themselves in removal proceedings. But all of the legal service providers that we work with are available to provide referrals, sometimes within their own organizations, or they might be able to find a different nonprofit organization that can support them and be able to be that expert panel. And then we also aren't currently doing any employment-based petitions, but they can also provide those referrals like I was discussing. And again, all of the 9 legal service providers that are participating in this project could do classroom presentations, can do campus-wide presentations. I know we all find ourselves currently in a very remote environment, and we would hope to have these town hall meetings, but our providers are well equipped to be able to have these informational sessions through Zoom and be able to provide that opportunity. So as we all know, DACA is available for students to take advantage of, though even those that might not have been available earlier on to file a new application. Our legal service providers can do a DACA workshop where they can go through in-depth conversations about the types of documents that you need, how to fill it out. The ILRC, and we'll be sharing that out later, has an annotated DACA form so that you can come prepared to these workshops. So for our participating colleges, reach out to your chosen legal service provider, or reach out to myself, and I can connect you, and we can plan for DACA renewal workshops or know your rights presentations as we, this current administration winds down and the Biden administration ramps up, as we discussed today. There could be many other factors that happen in the next several weeks. So let's make sure that all of our students, our campuses, and our communities know that their rights are protected and know what necessary steps to take in order to, do those family preparedness and talk about potential options in case, they do find themselves in removal proceedings. So how to access the services at the community colleges. There are 65 campuses out of the 116 California community colleges that are participating in this initial pilot phase, and they're spread across through the 7 guided pathways regions. When we had thought through this project early on, we wanted everybody to be in person, but given the remote nature, all of our providers are providing services through Zoom, through phone calls, through email. We're getting very creative in order to meet the students' needs. I know some of our students have technology barriers. Not everybody has a printer, not everybody has a camera. So, for those students that we're having a harder time to reach, let's connect them. Let's show them where they can go. The website, there's a website through the Chancellor's office where they can find the available attorney that can help them. And then once we hopefully return to campus, most of the campuses that are participating are within 11 miles or less, or about a 30-minute public transit ride if they wanted to meet with the attorney face-to-face. And the California community colleges are serving all students regardless of which campus you attend. So while there might only be 65 campuses that are deemed as our hosts, they are, all of the providers are ready and able to support those students that need the support services given their capacity. So, I encourage all of our students, faculty, and staff to reach out, to visit the website, to figure out which students or which provider you can schedule an appointment with. If there isn't an available appointment, either reach out to them via the phone or additional means if there's a sense of urgency. If you can't find an available appointment and have an urgent need, reach out to myself with the college that you're from, and I will make sure that our attorney connects with you and that we can find the legal remedy as quickly as possible. So at the end of, when I send out all of the resources and the PowerPoint and the recording, there'll be a direct link to where you can see which area your college falls under, which provider, and which college is being able to provide these support services. And I do see that there are a couple of questions in the chat, so we'll go ahead and answer some of those as we move along. So again, our services are open and able to all students, but thank you all for participating in our conversation today. I really learned a lot from both Allison, Sally, and Grisel about where we kind of find ourselves in the state, and hopefully we can be able to continue in this positive trajectory. We'll be in touch as we know more from the Texas case regarding DACA. If you haven't already done so, please sign up for the Undocumented Student Support newsletter. That's the vessel that we use to communicate everything out, from these informational webinars to services available, to any changes in immigration policies, any victories, or anything that we deem will negatively affect our students. So again, thank you all. There's a question from Dominic, and the services at the community colleges are funded similarly to those services from the CSU, the Department of Social Services, contracts with the 9 legal service providers. I myself just make sure that our students are aware of them and help with that education and outreach. The legislature did appropriate an additional allotment of 10 million to keep the services going for the CCCs, as well as an additional investment of 7 million to keep the CSU system going. And for students that are looking to transfer to a UC, the UC system also has their own immigration legal services, and they vary by the various UC campus that you are interested in attending. And I'll make sure to include that link as well as part of the resources that we're sharing out. But before we wrap up, Allison, Sally, or Grisel, any last words or any parting words of wisdom?
Alonso, I apologize if you already mentioned this. If you didn't, we do hope to come back after Joe Biden is inaugurated and give folks an update on what we know within that first 100 days of the Biden administration. So hope you can all join us when it's, maybe we'll know a little bit more. And I just want to thank your audience for all the really great questions. It really helps us understand where there's confusion in the community, where we can provide resources that hopefully shed some light on what we do know, and really thank everyone for their resilience during what's been a really challenging time to follow how immigration works. And thank you, Alonso and Anna, for putting together a great webinar today.
Thank you, Sally, and the rest of the ILRC team for this informational webinar. Like Sally mentioned, we will be coming back in February. If you sign up for the newsletter, you'll receive more in-depth information on the topics that will be covered, when and how to sign up for additional informational webinars. Thank you all. The webinar recording, this presentation, again, the resources discussed will be shared out with you within the next day or so. Keep an eye out in your email box. If for some reason you don't come across it in your email box, please reach out to myself, Anna, and we'll be happy to share out the information. So thank you everybody for participating, and I hope you all have a wonderful and safe holiday season.